Welcome to the CAA 2023 webinar series. Today's webinar is Are They Triple OK in conjunction with Are You OK's Kathleen Tan and Matthew Newlands. Thanks for joining us and please enjoy.
Hello, my name's David Waters and I'm the Chief Executive of the Council of Ambulance Authorities. Welcome to the latest in our webinar series. Today's webinar is titled Are They Triple OK? Aiming to increase levels of peer support for emergency service workers and volunteers nationwide. Today's presenter is Matt Newlands, the Are You OK Community Ambassador. Matt is a husband, father, and passionate health advocate, particularly for the first responder community. Following 10 years service as a frontline police officer for the South Australian Police, Matt endured significant mental distress, including personal experiences with suicide and a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress and depression. More importantly, Matt learnt firsthand the life-saving impacts of having good mates checking in and supporting him through the mental distress. Matt has been an Are You OK Community Ambassador since 2019 and lives by the beach south of Adelaide. Matt, Are You OK Community Ambassador, will share his first-hand experiences as a former first responder and insights into the Are You OK campaign. Are They Triple OK? Which aims to increase levels of peer and social support for emergency service workers and volunteers nationwide. Learn practical tools and tips to encourage emergency service personnel to regularly connect and have meaningful conversations and genuinely ask, are you okay? So that as a first responder community, we can support peers and loved ones who are struggling long before they are in crisis. Join me in welcoming Matt.
Hi, I'm Kathleen, and I am one of the campaign managers here at Are You OK? And very welcome to have Matt Newlands, who is one of our Are You OK community ambassadors. Hey, Matt.
Hey, Kathleen, how are you?
Good, thank you. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here today. Really what we'd love to do is to share some insights into our Are They Triple OK campaign, which is all about increasing social support for those in the emergency services, including volunteers and also their family and friends nationwide. And also just to give you some practical tools and tips on how to have an Are You OK conversation. So before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge the land which we are all dialing in from today and pay my respects, or our respects, to elders past, present and future. I'd also like to acknowledge the diversity of First Nations people and their cultures, their ongoing connection to country and the strength that they have garnered through such connections. So we're very lucky to have Matt here today, and Matt will share some of his story throughout the webinar as well. So I just want to acknowledge anyone who is on the call today who has lived experience of suicide or been impacted by suicide, and just to let you know that there will be some references to that today. So just to make sure that you are looking after yourself or have a trusted friend that you could talk to. And, obviously, please feel free to step away from the webinar if anything does come up. So just to give you some context as to who we Are You OK was started by a man named Gavin Larkin. Unfortunately, Gavin lost his father to suicide, and really that's where Are You OK was born. Gavin wanted to make sure that no one else experienced, what he and his family went through, and his whole idea was that in the time that it takes to have a coffee with someone is the time that it can take to really help change a life. That is where Are You OK sits. We are all about community connection and creating those conversations. It is about that early intervention. So Are They Triple OK? We're very lucky to have people like Matt on the call and those who have worked with us on developing this campaign. We've worked very closely with an advisory group and also different organisations to make sure that what we are putting out in the community is going to be of use to you. But essentially the campaign was born in response to the Answering the Call survey. We know that those who work in the emergency services are twice as likely to have suicidal thoughts over that of the general population, and also 3 times more likely to have a suicide plan. This is why it was really important for us to have this campaign and really start those conversations to help break down stigma within the industry. So to give you some insight, I'd just like to play a quick video just to share with you what Are They Triple OK is and how it might be relevant to you on the call today.
Put our uniform on and become immune to the challenges of society. Actual fact, we often take on quite significant pressures and traumatic experiences. You're seeing and doing things that many other people in our community never see or do. Yes, we put a uniform on, but at the end of the day, it comes off and we come home and we're just normal people.
People who work in the emergency services are often quite strong people, and I think their families and friends see them as quite strong. So it can be really hard for those roles to be reversed.
Putting on the uniform for the first time made me feel incredibly proud. And I think one of the parts I noticed when I did know that something wasn't right was when I couldn't put the uniform on, when I would look at it or know that I was getting ready for that next day at work, and it was just crippling anxiety. I didn't want to open up for a long time because it was just too confronting and scary, because you don't know how people are going to react.
Traditionally, emergency services has been a male-dominated workforce. So with that comes this stereotype of being stoic and brave. How's your day?
Same old same.
But sometimes being brave too is speaking up when you're having issues and reaching out to your mates and checking in on them. And by putting steps in place to support people who reach out for help because they need it, it's improving culture. It's reducing stigma. Have the conversation. You know, if you need, consult with Are You OK conversation guide. Ask a friend who's perhaps been involved with that before. Ring the employee support coordinator. Gain some information in order to give you the confidence to have that conversation. That early intervention and having that conversation is absolutely vital.
The best time to ask an Are You OK question is any time. The important thing is that you ask it. If it means saving someone, if it means saving someone's family life or their marriage or their friendship, then that's a good thing. The power of a conversation can break the cycle and change someone's life.
Matt, thanks for joining us here today. You used to have a background in the emergency services. I'm just thinking, after watching that little video, if you were able to share, I guess, a bit about your background and any insights that you have after watching that, and, you know, what your thoughts are around it.
Thanks, Kathleen. So, yeah, my name is Matt Newlands. I've been community ambassador with Are You OK since 2019, and that was born out of a 10-year service career with South Australia Police, and so I joined the police in 2006 and got out in 2016 in quite traumatic circumstances, which I want to talk on. But I actually know Dennis in the video there as well, and he's a very good mate of mine, and I think just by hearing some of those conversations and seeing people in uniform have those conversations and talk through some of those strategies, still, regardless of how many times I watch that video, it's a useful thing for me to see, and it's nice to see that constantly getting reminded in those resources, because I think there's often a big challenge out there of what do we actually do? How do we actually support each other? And I think one of the interesting things, the statistics that also came out of the Answering the Call survey, is that more than 99% of the 21,000 paid and volunteer emergency services participants of that survey, more than 99% of them said that they wanted to support their colleague if they were actually experiencing some mental health challenges. So I think I was not surprised by those statistics. And I think that that's probably just generally a comment to the service community as wanting to be of service to our mates as well. So I think it's just the question then often is, well, how do we actually do that, and how do we do that well? So if I go back a bit though, just I guess into my police background, I want to be a cop since I was 4 years old. And I think that that's important to bring up, because as I went through schooling and continued to say that I wanted to be a cop, it was starting to shape a large portion of my identity. And the work that I do now, which I'll touch on in a moment with emergency services personnel, the identity piece is one that is often that gets challenged when there is the mental health challenges arise. But During my time at the police academy, I loved it. I joined when I was 20. I had my 21st birthday at the police academy, which was relatively tame and boring because of all the assessments and exams that were required. But I graduated in November of 2006. And as a 21-year-old kid, basically. But for me, that was a really important part of that identity being formed. I was provided my warrant card. I was given my number. I now had this role in the community that was really quite. It is a quite important role. So as I went through, I did my first 6 months at Sturt Police Station here in Adelaide, which was very much like a metropolitan style policing. Very steep learning curve. I'm sure you can imagine as a young kid now out there trying to almost tell people how to live their life and to attempt to restore order at times when it was in disorder. But there was that exposure right from the get-go to, I guess, the challenges that come with service for other people as they navigate mental health challenges. There's, I guess, there's death, there's traumatic events, there's always a number of chronic stresses that come into that role. And I was fortunate to have some good police officers around me that helped model ways in which I could manage that as it comes through. But then there's also that part that we see common. I think Dennis touched on it in his little video there as well, around the stigma that can come up. I think the challenge for me over the first few years of my career was as I was being exposed to significant events, trauma and the chronic stress, there was a perception that others seemed to have it together. And I thought that if I was having, say, an emotional response to a particular situation, I became quite good at just suppressing that and pushing it to one side, compartmentalizing, some might say. And I think that that's actually a really useful, critical skill for service members to harness and refine. But over time, it can become our undoing as well. So I did my 6 months at Sturt. I went up to Port Augusta, which was a bit more of like a more country style policing. I did that for a couple of years. And then when I returned back down to Christie's Beach, again, which is a bit more of like a metropolitan style policing, I found that I was starting to get quite confident and competent in my role. I was obviously a few years in the job. I was had a bit of experience. Still had a lot to learn, but had good people around me still helping. And I was starting to work through my career aspirations and where I was going to go. But I think by that stage, the identity of the role had completely consumed me. I had become the police. And again, I bring it up intentionally because I think that this is the one part for me as I started to become unwell that was likely the cause for most of the challenge that came up, is that my identity was being compromised. There was a particular job in 2013 when I was the acting sergeant or supervisor of a small team. There was a job that came up at my friend's place. He was off duty at the time. He was a very highly regarded police officer at our station, and just a genuinely good guy, just a top bloke. A job had come up. The patrol sergeant had contacted me and said, we need to get to our friend's place. And so I sent one of my crews there, and one of the patrol crews went as well. Unfortunately, when they arrived, we could see the ambulance members were already at the scene, and unfortunately they weren't able to save our friend. And I have no doubt they did absolutely everything they possibly could, and that was substantiated by the fact that I saw that even the ambulance officers were having an emotional response to the situation. And I think the first responder community is such a really tight-knit family. They knew that they were trying to save an off-duty police officer, and I think for one of the members in particular, they were actually friends with him as well. So that was really confronting, I think, for everybody involved. But my role there at the time, I think, which also contributed to some of the challenges after this event, as the supervisor, was required to take active steps and to investigate accordingly, and just to make sure that everything was following procedure. Now that's hard to then, on reflection, to prioritise that role over the role also of just being a friend of this guy who had unfortunately taken his life, and also a close friend of the other members or the other officers who were also at the scene. So not only was it that personal grief, but it was also the empathetic grief as well, of like having my friends, having to support them too, and just sort of push that to one side. That emotional suppression stuff came up, and we actually call it emotional discipline. And so parking that to the side, I knew that at the time it felt the right way to do it was just to double down on policing, and that was my coping strategy, was to not necessarily lean into any of those difficult or confronting emotional responses, rather keep them compartmentalized and just focus on doing the work. Now that has a lifespan, having that approach, and for me, from the end of 2013. When unfortunately our friend had taken his life, through to about the beginning of 2015, my mental health deteriorated really quite quickly. A lot of the things that I can look back on now as being things like broken sleep. I struggled to get to sleep, and that came on relatively soon. And then I struggled with that for some time. So I would rely quite heavily on alcohol, which again, I think is a pretty common coping mechanism or coping strategy, particularly within the service industry. So I was drinking a fair bit. I wasn't sleeping very much, and then I was relying quite heavily on caffeine through the day, because it's an easily accessible drug to be able to get access to help out, and it's socially accepted. It's not uncommon to see, especially service personnel, like to see one without a coffee, or at least a cold coffee, sitting in the car, is pretty common. So I was relying on that, but what I was finding is that over time, and relatively quickly, that emotional suppression meant that I found it difficult to turn emotions back on again. And so I found that I was becoming quite withdrawn and disconnected, not only from my family, but also from friends, and starting to, I guess, lose a lot of sense of myself in a lot of the things that I was doing outside of work. So I doubled down on work and continued to do just focus on that. The challenge was a bit of a perfect storm by the beginning of 2015. I recognised that things weren't going so well for me. I wasn't talking to anybody about it. I was keeping it very much to myself. And I think that this is the reason for that goes back to the identity piece. I was really concerned by the beginning of 2015 when I recognised that things weren't going so well. And when I had gone to a doctor and he was referred to a psychologist, and they started to talk about things like showing signs of post-traumatic stress and depression, it was a real threat to my identity, because I wasn't sure how that would fit in my career anymore. And because I had become, policing was such an important part, not just of my life, but also of my family, my wife and my young daughter at this stage. It's not just the individual who signs up for these jobs. It really is a family and a more broader community approach. I was really concerned about what would happen to my career if I was to say anything. So made, I guess, a common but foolish decision of just keeping this stuff to myself, and just thinking if I just wait and I write it out, maybe things will get better. I don't think in the history of just writing things out, things have ever necessarily got better when it comes to certainly the mental health challenges. And so unfortunately, by about May of 2015 was when things had really taken quite a significant hold of me, and that threat to identity, I was starting to really believe a lot of the thoughts I was having around not necessarily being a good person anymore, and feeling as though that I was, I guess, losing control of my life. And so in May 19 of 2015, I'd made the first decision to take my life. Now, the reason why I'm still here at that particular point was I was on the phone to my mum, actually, when I was in Adelaide. Mum was in Sydney, and Mum said to me on the phone, she said, like, I know what you're planning on doing, and I can't get back there to stop you, which is a really, on reflection, a really challenging thing, I'm sure, as a parent to hear your child in that state of distress and not be able to be there to support me. But I think just the nature of the conversation itself there was a little bit of hope there. But at the end of the conversation, my mum said to me, can you please promise me you'll go to your mate's house, which was just around the corner. And so I did that. I promised Mum that I would, and I figured that I would go see my friend, and then I would go through with the plans that I had for the afternoon, purely so I didn't feel as though I was, lying to my mum. But the conversation that I had with that friend, was not specifically around how significant things were. We didn't necessarily go into any details. He could see that I was in a state of distress and that I was hurting, and we just sat on the couch and we just talked. And I can't even remember what it was that we talked about, but I think just being in company of a good friend, someone who was holding space for me and wasn't necessarily trying to fix anything, was such an integral part to that particular moment. Now, I ended up getting out of the police in 2016 as a result of some mental health challenges. But there was also two other friends as well that are still very close to me to this day, that I started to open up to about what was actually going on for me. And when I realized that speaking to those guys, one, I wasn't judged in any way. There was no there was no reflection of me as an individual. There was no reflection of my capability as a police officer or anything like that was ever questioned. It was just recognition of, yeah, you're going through a really significant time right now, and how is it that we might be able just to sit with you and support you in that. Was such an integral part to me getting well. And it was really for that situation was the catalyst that a few years later down the track, my cousin was actually connected to Are You OK? And I found out that this community ambassador role was one that I could get involved in. And it was an opportunity for me to really use, I guess, some of my stuff as an example of this is why it's important for us to lean on each other and to talk to our mates and just to really instill some confidence and in other people to have those difficult, meaningful conversations. Because, we're talking about Gavin as well, Gavin Larkin before. That's all it takes. There really is such a safety in just being with friends, where you don't have to necessarily come up with all the solutions right then and there, but it's about just how is it that you can just work on something together and just be supported in that in a very trusting environment. So that was a real critical reason, and I've been heavily involved with Are You OK since then, and certainly don't see anything changing anytime soon.
Amazing. Yeah. Thanks, Matt. I really appreciate you sharing your story and being so generous in sharing that as well. And I think that's one of the things in terms of when I've been speaking to emergency service workers and volunteers, regardless of what agency you're from, I think there's something really beautiful in knowing that you're not alone and that other people are going through similar things to perhaps what you're feeling as well. And just knowing that there are other people out there and hearing other people's stories and other people's voices, I think that's a big part in helping to break down that stigma of being the ones you are in the community eyes and our eyes. You are the heroes, you are the ones wearing the bulletproof vest, but underneath the uniform, you are people, you are everyday people, you are someone's mum, brother, sister, friend. And I think sometimes it's really easy, as you said, in that identity to forget about that, not only for others, but also yourself. Thank you for sharing that. And I think, we're very lucky to have you as an ambassador, but also within the emergency services community, because I think starting these conversations within the community is also so much of the journey in terms of changing the culture. That won't happen overnight, but will take some time. And this is, one step in that journey. So thank you. You touched on before some of the signs that you had yourself in terms of not sleeping. And I just thought to make this as practical as well for those on the call, perhaps we can chat through, you can share some of your insights into, what might be going on for people thinking, oh, perhaps I noticed that something's not quite right with someone that I work with or one of my family members. How do I start preparing for an Are You OK conversation and noticing what might need to, or noticing what's going on and then what they might need to know in order to give them the confidence to actually have the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think you touched on a really important point, and this slide is really valuable for that, because one of the messages that I really want to highlight with especially the first responder community is that we often are very much experts in each other's lives. We spend so much time with our colleagues, our team, our partner, regardless of what service that is, and there's often some very open dialogue that is already going on. We often know if the person is married, has children, if there's sickness in the family, if there's other sort of stresses or challenges that are going on. But we also become very accustomed to the mannerisms and the behaviours in which each other shows up in. And I think, like, KT, just you and I being friends, there's probably an understanding as well as to, like, if I was to show up on this call in a particular way, that might actually raise a bit of a red flag, because it could be the things, maybe the language that I'm using or the way that I'm saying things. Maybe if I was to, like, be showing up and behaving in a different way. I think this is the important point, is don't underestimate those little things, that gut feeling that you're like, that seems like a little bit off, that the person doesn't usually talk like that. They don't usually behave that way. It's common for me to see them at the gym in the morning and they're not there. It's common for me to see them maybe at work 10 minutes early and they're not. Maybe they're rocking up late, or vice versa. Maybe they're turning up a little bit earlier. I think the other important point that's on there is that what's going on in their life. I think, again, because often there's those conversations had in the car, in the meal room, often over the, stuck in having a coffee or whatever the case is, where you're waiting for some process to happen. We generally do get to know what's going on in each other's life, and recognizing that if someone is going through, whether it be financial stress, relationship stress, maybe some sickness or physical illness, other mental health challenges that might be going on, just sort of recognizing that they can potentially be having a significant contributing factor to that person's life. So yeah, I think that this is don't ever underestimate being an expert in each other's lives. I think is an important point.
And I guess as well, as much, as we're looking out for other people, I think it's really important to as well just check in on yourself before having an "Are you okay?" conversation. Are you able to share with us, some of the things that you might think of before having a conversation to say, hey, is this the right time for this to take place?
Absolutely, and because I think the first one there that you've got there is, am I ready? It's a really important point. Like, am I prepared to have a conversation? If I'm going to lean in to a difficult conversation and ask someone, are you okay? And be ready for them to say, actually, I've got some things going on right now. Am I in a position to be able to support this person? And that's just be able to, am I in the right headspace? Am I feeling like I'm up to just hearing what might be going on? Because we inevitably have these conversations with people we genuinely love and care about. So it always has some level of an impact on us. So it's just recognizing that, am I ready? And I think as far as the preparation and have I picked my right moment, the obvious ones are, especially like in a first responder community, am I about to walk into the charge counter, or am I about to walk into a hospital with a patient? Are we about to just pull up on a job, where we're required? That might not be the best place or time to say, hey, KT, is everything going okay? Like, I've noticed this, and this, because you've just limited the amount of time to be able to actually explore that. And the last thing we want to do is to really uncover some of those challenges and then cut that conversation off really quickly and leave that person maybe in a heightened state. So there's probably some really key points there. Is now the right time? Should we wait to the end of the shift, maybe in the change rooms? Can we go for a coffee after work? Maybe can I even see you like before work, rock up an hour early, half hour earlier, and just try to carve out that time to say, I'd really like to just have a chat with you, just to check in and see how things are going. We know first responders are movers. They generally in the gym or going doing something. So again, I've had conversations with people in the gym while we're training. And I think it's a perfect segue to the 4 steps of an "Are you okay?" conversation. I think even now there's a bit of dialogue around, I've asked the question, like, now what? There is actually the 3 extra steps, which I'm really passionate about. So it's one thing to know you're ready, ask the question. You ask that however suits you and your friendship, whatever dialogue or whatever you'll normally use. It doesn't have to be explicitly, are you okay? There's a stack of different conversation starters that are on the screen there, and you pick the right most appropriate response to that level of friendship. So if there's something going on, I like the one that I've noticed, because I think there's very much, when we ask this question, people will default to, yeah, I'm fine. So sometimes it can take maybe 1 or 2 questions being asked, and then if I've still got concerns, just naming something that I've noticed. So I think that's an important one. My favorite step is the listen step, which is the next bit. And what we try to say here to people is really encouraging people to listen, to understand, not to respond. So often, again, we can get caught up in this dialogue, this back and forth, and feeling like we need to come up with either the answer or something that is going to make them feel better, or even just like to manage some awkward silence. But it's not about that. It's really about just creating some space for the individual just to share what's going on for them. And silence is okay. Silence is often the best friend of more information. So then they can help just sort of unload a little bit more. And this is the bit where people go like, I just need to vent, let them vent, say the things they need to say. And there's some really great prompters there on the screen too. So the step 3 is a good one, because we, like I said before, we don't necessarily want to leave people just left in this heightened state. Encouraging action is really around, there's a good chance that the person who is going through some type of challenge or distress might actually know what they need to do. They just might not necessarily know how to do it or where to go to get the resources. And so for this one, this encouraging action is really around trying to make sure that you've got an opportunity to encourage that person to take those steps that they want to take. And if they don't know what those steps are, you may have some resources in your back pocket. But even questions like that, what are some first steps we could take together? Have you spoken to your doctor? Have you spoken to other people? Just what we're trying to do is really encourage people to connect in with their community of care around them. And you as the friend is kind of like that conduit, that safe space to go, I've done this and it didn't work, or and then they can come back, or I've done this and it is working, and it's just encouraging that to continue as well. So the other important question that you had there as well, how can I support you? And that could be even just leaning on some of these resources here, and the Are You OK conversation starter cards have these resources. Otherwise, I'd encourage people to take a photograph of the screen. The thing is that a lot of these numbers, a lot of people know about already, but this is a great place to start with someone who maybe is not quite sure what to do next or where to go. There's some really great resources out there as well, and you can find some more of those resources at areyouok.org as well. And then finally, what you really want to be doing is checking in. You've asked the person, you've listened to what's going on, you've encouraged them to take some action. It could be that they are going to go and have a conversation with some family, or to maybe make a doctor's appointment if that's what they think is the most appropriate thing to do. The check-in thing is just to come, I guess, close that loop. Hey KT, how did you go? You were going to talk to your mates about that particular thing, or you were going to ask the boss for a bit of time off to create some space. Whatever the case is, this is an opportunity just for that person to still know that you're there. You're still able to lean into that conversation and just see how they're traveling. Because if the action that they've taken hasn't necessarily served them well, it's possible we might just need to go back and revisit some of those other options of action. And we just keep that process rolling through. Have the conversations, encourage the action, check in. And I'm sure over time, in my experience, this is how we create a really connected community.
Matt, I just want to ask, in speaking to some of the different emergency service workers and volunteers, one of the things that they're most concerned about, if they notice that something's wrong and they want to ask the question, a lot of people are saying, what if they say, no, I'm not okay? And that's really one of the barriers for them asking the question. Sometimes you feel like you want to fix it. Obviously, these are people that are close to you. What would you say to someone who's maybe a little bit hesitant, because even though we've got these steps in place, they still might feel, what do I do if the answer is no, they're not okay?
It's a really good point. I think I often try to just use questions, open questions that can help me understand what's going on. Tell me more about that. Do you know what it is that's happening? Because I think the other challenge sometimes can be people might not necessarily know. No, I'm not okay, but I don't really know why. I'm feeling like this. All right, well, look, can we just make some time? We can catch up and we can just unpack what's going on for you. And I guess even if someone is in that conversation, recognizing maybe the different domains of someone's life, how's work going, how's relationships going, and just prompting all those questions and really just trying to open up the playing field, if you like, of trying to name what might be going on in that person's life. Look, life is really challenging right now, with increased interest rates, with huge demands on the first responder community, whether it be the health sector, the police, and certainly the fire space. there is a huge demand from community on these first responders, and so sometimes it can feel a little overwhelming. We don't necessarily know what might be actually wrong with me and where to actually start. So I would just encourage people just to, I guess, it's easy from the cheap seats to say, don't be afraid of the conversation, but please don't, go in with a sense of curiosity and support. And I'm sure with some open questions, the person will be able to open up and let them know what's going on. I think, again, perfect segue on the screen there. You see there are some extra resources on the ruok.org.au website. Triple OK campaign, other Triple OK campaigns specifically has some targeted material around these conversations. And just recently, we were on RUOK, obviously produced the Are They Triple OK podcast series as well. There's I'm your host, so for what that's worth, but some fantastic guests on there from ex-Queensland Fire, Queensland Police, New South Wales Fire and Rescue, and also a New South Wales police officer. And I'm sure there'll be additional resources around the podcast. But I know that those three guests, the three guests we've had so far, have really been able to provide insight into how their experience has gone with having some of those challenging conversations. But there's a stack of other resources at the website too, which I'd encourage people to go and have a look at or scan the QR code. So, and I guess, Katie, I might throw to you then maybe to talk about the campaign for this year as we bring it to a close.
Yeah, absolutely. So coming up on the 14th of September is our Are You OK Day. And our message for this year is I'm here to hear. Thursday the 14th is our National Day of Action, but we do remind everyone that every day is the day to ask, are you okay? And to check in on those that you love, your family, your friends, your peers. And this year, we're really encouraging all Australians to create a space for meaningful conversation. As I said, the theme is I'm here to hear, and asking are you okay is definitely the first step, but we also need to genuinely listen to what comes next. So we're really asking people to let people know in your world that you're really here to hear. And as Matt mentioned, we have free resources on our website at ruok.org.au. If you'd like to get involved on the day, there's a stack of resources there on either how to get your workplace involved, how to get your community involved, but of course conversation guides as well, so that you have these steps on how to have an Are You OK conversation. As I said, resources on our websites. And just as we finish off today, just to have a think about who in your world, not only will you ask, are you okay of, but who will you hear? So Matt, thank you so much for joining us today on this call. Did you have any other things you'd like to end with?
No, just say I really would encourage organisations to get around the Are You OK campaign throughout the year. Like you said, it's not just the one day. Are You OK is very passionate about delivering this message and content throughout the year. And you'll also find the opportunity to tap into some of the ambassador speakers as well. So there's quite a large community of others that are able to come out to workplaces and to share a bit of their story and to have some of those conversations. So yeah, I'd just really get involved.
Amazing. And thank you everyone for joining the call today. Thank you for being first responders within our community. We hope that you all look after each other as well as yourselves. So thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing your story with us. We really appreciate it. We know it's not the easiest of things to do, but unfortunately it's not uncommon, particularly in our emergency services. I think we need to face up to the fact that the person sitting next to you could be going through exactly the same thing as you've been through. You mentioned your coping mechanism by driving into your work after the incident with your colleague. On reflection and having tools and knowledge now, what would be your recommendation for coping in the acute phase after an emotionally challenging incident?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Nicole. And I think on reflection now, I find myself regularly talking about how I would have maybe liked to have done things a little bit differently. And I think one of the first points is really having a mental health literacy now that would have been super useful back then. I think you kind of touched on a point at the very end of your question where you spoke about it being an individual response, and I'd have to really highlight the importance of that. So for me personally, I think probably a bit of both. There's not necessarily any harm in diving back into work, because it can be a useful distraction. It can be a safe place just to, I guess, know, like I talk about my time in uniform. I knew what was required of me. I knew what my responsibilities were. And so there was a safety in just going back to work, which is why I think it was such an attractive thing to do. But I think that had I had my time again, I would have spent more time exploring the emotional impact on me as an individual, because I have to also acknowledge the fact that the nature of the work that we do, as much as it might be a distraction, it's also like getting back into the fire after being burnt. So just having to be mindful of that. So the reason why I say that it's the important part around it being such an individual response is because we need to be careful, one, that we don't necessarily cause alarm for some people. When we talk about trauma, it's the emotional response to an event, not necessarily the event itself. So that's why we get those varied responses to different things. So you don't necessarily want everybody then feeling like, because they've been exposed to a significant event, that they're now on this path to a mental health challenge or a mental illness. So it's about just really trying to acknowledge where that individual is at their time, their point of their career. Some people can attend to these things and just move on to the next job. Others, it's having a significant impact at the time. So I'm careful around saying, yes, we need to make sure that we have these really intense debriefs post-critical incident like this, because it can just prolong the negative experience for people too. So we do have to make sure that we create a psychologically safe place for individuals to have these conversations. But the short answer is, I think for me, it would have been a bit of both. I would have nothing wrong in going back into work, but certainly trying to start speaking to other people and certainly seeking some professional support.
You know, at the end of the shift, when you take off the uniform, how do you transition back into a non-uniform life? And I guess the same goes for when anybody leaves the service, whether voluntarily in retirement or otherwise. You know, it's a massive adjustment that has to be made. Any thoughts on that, Matt?
Yeah, look, this is a really meaty conversation. Some would probably be looking at this thinking that I still have an identity issue, because although I'm out of the police, I'm still working very heavily with military and emergency services personnel, not only in my role with Are You OK, but the company that I have in my day job, if you like. The identity piece is a really challenging one to navigate, because especially for service roles, it's not a 9 to 5. You sign up, you go do your work for a particular start point and finish point. There's many that are on this call and in other rooms that would know that you're always an AMBO, you're always a copper, you're always a firefighter, and so you don't necessarily get to pick and choose. So a lot of the stuff that I do now, especially with I guess the counselling side of the company that I have, in talking to military and emergency services personnel, is really trying to look at the responsibility versus the assumed responsibility. And because we put the uniform, we take the uniform off, that can be a bit of an indicator, but those around us know that we're still this particular identity, we've got a particular skill set. So a lot of the work now is really trying to just, I guess, sit with this. Am I required right now? Do I have a routine or a process in which I might be able to shut down the shift and then become, those other roles and tap into those other roles, like in my case, being a husband and being a father, prioritizing that responsibility over the need for, because I heard a noise outside, that I have to now go outside and turn that cop thing back on again. And my mum experiences something similar. She's a nurse, so sometimes if we're out for lunch in a public place, we've had experiences where someone has collapsed, and there's I guess some element of joy or service that still comes with being able to help people in their time of need, but it's also recognizing, like, what's the impact back on me. I know some organisations are starting to explore, especially the military, is starting to explore this transition out of service. But I think Joshua's really hit an important point when we talk about transition of role, or that identity piece when we finish a shift. So I also would encourage people to listen in or have conversations with other people around this, find what maybe others are doing. And the Are You OK podcast series as well, that we've got, the Arvo Triple OK podcast, there's a couple of guests already on there, and we'll be going to be interviewing or speaking to a number of more guests in the future. And I guess if I can offer that, I'll take that on notice as well, Joshua, and maybe put that question specifically to the future guests that we have.
I'm trying to find that point where you can actually turn off your work personality and turn your home personality back on. I think it's an increasingly wide problem for our society.
If I can add just a practical tip there, I really encourage people to have like a routine, a particular process that they go through that is like a physical process. For some, it might be like walking in and maybe getting rid of the uniform and having a shower before they then go and sit on the couch. For others, it can be, maybe going outside and playing with the dog or taking the dog for a walk, whatever those things that suit your lifestyle best is like really trying to put a routine in that gives you that, I guess, the cognitive difference that says like, I've finished my work. Maybe you reverse into the same spot of the driveway every single time. You'd be surprised at some of the strategies that people are coming up with as those mental cues to give themselves permission to just turn off and then focus on other things.
How much courage it takes both to ask the question, are you okay, but also to say that you're not. The helpful tips and hints that you gave during your presentation made a lot of sense. But how do you stop, as an individual, how do you stop yourself when you've asked a question to start to provide solutions? Because that's kind of human nature, is to try and fix stuff, isn't it? Particularly for emergency service personnel.
Yeah, particularly for emergency services personnel. But you're right, it's a human response. I think generally you're having these conversations with someone you trust and care about. So there's a desire to want to stop that person from feeling a certain way, like certainly if it's a negative emotion. So I think that's why I really like the second step of the 4 steps. The listen for me is my favorite step for that reason, because I know when I'm having those conversations, and I'm afforded an opportunity to practice this regularly in my day-to-day, but just trying to avoid any responsibility of having to step in to try to fix anything usually is mitigated by my own internal dialogue that says, just listen to understand. Just let this person say what they need to say. There's a good chance, again, in my experience, that for many people that I have these conversations with, they probably know, like, maybe the things that they want to try or the things that have worked for them in the past. But the analogy I often use is it's often like just taking one of those old school kettles off the heat, when it's boiling and it's whistling and it's making that really like annoying noise. It's about then saying like, I'll take this off the heat, the noise stops. It doesn't stop the contents from being boiling hot, but it allows us an opportunity just to slow things down.
Having any form of mental illness or unwellness is a major barrier for people seeking help. I had a presentation just actually last week where the presenter said it's about 14 years on average before someone actually gets help. I'm just interested in, I guess, that the broken brain can't fix itself. How does, obviously the "are you okay" question is key, but on the other side of the fence, how do you kind of make that breakthrough?
It's an interesting question, and I think I'm drawn to the presentation that I did as well, where I didn't necessarily, I kind of closed the gap to suggest that it was because of my mental health challenges that my career ended, and I need to be very careful that that's not the message that's constantly out there. That was my experience. There's lots of stories out there where people have navigated mental health challenges and have gone on to continue a very long, sustainable, meaningful career. And I think it's really important for us to hear more of those stories. And I guess to add to that as well is I'm a firm believer in that if we can talk about things and encourage conversations well before they become, something that is significant, that might be a diagnosable mental health challenge that requires some significant intervention. If we can start having some conversations and rallying a community of care around people much sooner, then there's a far greater likelihood of still maintaining, I guess, a very long, sustainable career. Because as you heard in my story, like that was the biggest piece of the stigma was the threat to my career or the threat to my identity. And I know that there'll be people on this call that will be thinking, I'm trying to get through some stuff, but I don't want work to know, just in case. Like, what would I do if I wasn't, in the ambulance service? And I think that's where we need to be reassuring people and talking through some of those stories, that it might mean that there's some adjustments to the day-to-day for a short period of time, but it's not a career ender. That's a really important message. For some, it might just be, but I'd like to hope that there's decisions that people are being able to make and they're involved in that process. But I think that if I can reassure people, there's lots and lots of stories out there of people who have navigated mental health challenges and gone back to work.
Is there more we could be doing to educate ourselves and each other in regards to, I guess, recognizing that in ourselves?
Yeah, I believe there is. I think that there's, look, it's absolutely necessary for people in service roles to harness or to refine this skill set of emotional suppression, because I guess in my policing career, if I was to be attending a scene and having an emotional response to that, similar to maybe the people who are already in attendance, that's not very useful. So there's a requirement, especially for like the scenes and the jobs that ambulance service would be attending on a day-to-day. There has to be an ability to be able to acknowledge that there's an emotional response, suppress it, and move on. And then it becomes a disciplined approach. The challenge that I find now is, like, for a lot of the work that I do as well, just even outside of Are You OK, is that for a lot of people, when asking them the question, like, what is the point of having emotions? It's often a question that many haven't even been asked before, because it's true. Like, we know that we have them, and service personnel get really good at like pushing them down until, like, that Pandora's box explodes open. But for a lot of people, they've never really questioned why it is that those emotions show up. And so that's I think a real key component to say, like, we need to still have an emotional response to something. We still need to be able to go to a particular scene, have that disciplined approach to look at ways in which we can suppress that emotion to get the job done. But then how do we actually turn that back on again? And what environments can we create for ourselves where we can explore and talk about the stuff and the challenges that we had? But what we often do as service members is we end up associating, the longer we're in our career, the less civilians we hang around with because of either shift work or people just don't quite understand the job. So we start to normalize these experiences. And now it's, everybody is doing the same thing. And we've kind of just gone, well, that's just part of the job. So I think there needs to be a huge amount of work that first responder agencies need to be doing around how is it that we provide that I guess, mental health literacy as a prevention mechanism, so that we don't wait for people to become unwell and then we're trying to rehabilitate them back to being well again. How can we keep people that are really, like, super skilled at these jobs just recognize what's going on for them and know when to harness that skill set and then maybe when to turn it back on?
No, I think Matt's covered it perfectly. But just a reminder that Are You OK Day is coming up, and it's a good opportunity to really think about the people in your world who might be going through some of life's ups and downs, which we all do.
Just head to iuk.org.au if you need anything else. Otherwise, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you for sharing your campaign. That's a really important one. You can be assured that we're behind it 100%, and we will be asking the question. So thanks again, and best of luck.
Thank you for attending Are They Triple OK? CPD points are available. Please email events@caa.net.au. You can view all of our upcoming webinars by visiting www.caa.net.au/webinars. And be sure to follow us on social media to keep up to date. Twitter @CAA Australasia, Facebook and LinkedIn, the Council of Ambulance Authorities. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.